is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jonathan Pereira is the Executive Director of the Plant Chicago. He has over 15 years of experience in science and arts education, primarily in informal and non-traditional learning environments. Specializing in environmental ed and youth development programs in urban areas, he's worked with youth in projects ranging from renewable energy to natural resource conservation. He most recently served as youth program manager for Green Corps Chicago, which engaged 800 Chicago public school students in bike maintenance and horticulture projects throughout the city. It is his first time in Champaign-Urbana, so please join me in giving Jonathan a very warm welcome.
I'm going to read my audience here a little bit. How many of you have ever grown your own food? Okay, cool. All right. How many of you have ever produced your own energy? Whoever raised your hand, how would you qualify that? What kind of energy did you produce? Did someone raise their hand? Okay, all right, we'll leave it there. How many of you practice composting? Okay, wow, there's a lot of people here. Great, so this is a good audience. As Casey mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Plant Chicago. We're a nonprofit located on the southwest side of Chicago. Our mission is to develop circular economies. Has anyone heard that term before? Circular. Aha, you have, okay. Fewer people, great. All right, if you're familiar with growing your own food, producing your own energy, or composting, in some ways you are already engaging in some sort of circular principle. There's actually no set definition of what a circular economy is. So I think the easiest way to describe it is what it's not. It's not linear. Businesses and individuals, we often think in very linear fashions in one direction. I liken it to living on the face of the earth, where we experience our day-to-day as flat, yet we know out there that the earth is round, yet we can't actually see it. It's the same thing in our day-to-day. Products come in, food comes in, we assemble materials to make a product, then we consume it, and it leaves our bodies, and we don't want to think about what happens afterwards, right? It goes one direction, in and out, just gone. Same thing with products. We assemble materials to make a product, put it all together, and then sell it. It's left, and we don't want to think about what happens afterwards. Or if we do, we claim we have no agency over what happens to it. So the challenge of a circular the problem and the challenge that a circular economy is addressing is really the biggest existential crisis of humanity, is that we live in a world of finite resources, yet we are operating as if there are infinite resources to consume. Does that make sense? Cool. However, when you break that down to how does that get actually implemented, there's some things. We're located in a facility called The Plant. We're co-located with over 20 different food businesses, ranging from coffee roasters, bread bakers, a brewery, a kombucha brewery, various growers, indoor and out, honey, an ice company, a spice company, and a cheesemonger, and more. So there's lots of opportunities that are presented when you start thinking about systems, but also you start thinking also at a facility scale. What can happen when you've drawn boundaries around a system? So we start thinking about it at a practical level, at a facility scale, an output from one process or one industry being repurposed as an input for another. That could happen in-house within one business operation or between businesses. And that, to me, is the really exciting potential of circular economies, is when businesses start working together and thinking about how materials and energy can flow between them. How many people here studied ecology? Wow, lots of composters and only a few people who have studied ecology. Okay, so, but you've all gone through high school. Wait, how many of you are actually students here at UC? Okay, so you went through high school, and I'm assuming everyone has studied here basic biology, and you remember that there are producers, consumers, and decomposers, correct? Yeah, all right, we'll scoot through that. So the simplified version of that. The producers are those magical creatures that can make their own food, plants. They go through a process called photosynthesis and create sugars out of that. Unlike consumers, we're very helpless, right? We can't make our own food, so we have to take it from other producers or consumers. And then in many of our our biology courses, we also say, oh yeah, there's these things called decomposers, right? Those are the really magical life forms. Genetically speaking, they're closer to consumers, not plants. They are the ones that enable all the other life to exist, right? They unlock the mineral content in the earth and make it accessible to plants. There's all sorts of negotiations that happen at the in the ecological, what I've labeled here ecological economics. Well, they're not dealing with money, there is a currency, and that currency is energy and nutrients. Fungi and plants have relationships where they often agree to exchange nutrients in exchange for sugars. Even consumers, right? We have an ongoing long-term relationship with bacteria in our gut. We've signed a long-term lease in order to digest many things. These bacteria, or the bacteria, have signed a long-term lease with us, one way around, to make digestion easier for us in exchange for some nutrients for them as well. We're all aware that our digestive tracts really don't operate well if we don't have that healthy gut bacteria. So if you start thinking about the ecosystem as another form of economic system, vice versa, can an economic system, what can we learn from an ecological system? Now, these aren't necessarily new concepts. This is building on many different thought leaders in this area, going back many decades. The circular economy is really adapting some ideas, specifically from cradle to cradle. If you're not familiar with that, that's okay. Go back and read the book. It's great. This is one diagram. This is coming from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, really thought leaders thinking about the circular economy and leading that from England and Europe. I'll break this down very generically. On the right side of the diagram as you're facing it, and the left side of the diagram as you are facing it. So the left side is what is being labeled biological nutrients, what we typically think of as nutrients. On the right side are what are being called technical nutrients. So things like the aluminum that was recycled and made into this is a technical nutrient. It doesn't break down easily in the environment. It's generally what, if we're in economic spheres, we'll call durable goods, whereas things like this are fast-moving goods, right? This is designed for single use, generally, even if it's made out of biological material or recycled plastic. These things, since I'm assuming this plate, does anyone know, is this plate made out of paper? I couldn't actually tell. Do we know? It's made out of paper? Okay, so it's a biological nutrient. It would fall on the left side of that diagram. If you guys have forks, it's recycled plastic, so this would fall on which side? Who think, you pointed to the right side? Yeah, right. It's, what's that? So it falls as we would classify this as a technical nutrient, a plastic. Anyone here familiar with bioplastics? This is what looks like this is. Which side would this fall on? Yeah, technically it probably would fall on the biologically based side, the biological nutrient. So this is something that in theory is safe to return to the soil or safe to return to the biosphere. So I'm going to put these two to the side. Now, practically speaking, we get into more complicated things about where does this go after we use it. We can get into that in a little bit later. But one critical thing I want to point out here is that these sort of ever-growing or ever-shrinking circles are about the energy it takes to engage in that process. Now, if you were raised in the 80s and 90s, a lot of times, at least in my world, we were taught a lot about recycling. Like the best way to be environmentally friendly is recycling. So a lot of times when you talk to people about sustainability, one of the first things they think about is recycling. But really in a circular economy, and actually in any kind of process, it's one of the least efficient things to do. What you're essentially doing is taking apart the material into its base components and then trying to reassemble it again back into those components. So when we recycle this plastic, it's great. We've taken plastic that had one life, taken it apart and put it back together again. Where really, the most ancient way we use these was just create one fork and use it over and over again, right? So really starting to question, is recycling really the most energy efficient use of a material? In a circular system, there are no such things as landfills. So it's really important you think about, in an idealized circular system, there's no such thing as a landfill. So it's really important you think about how are we using materials. On the technical side, recycling really should be the last thing. You're not designing for recycling, you're designing for reuse, or designing for no use at all, right? And how many times do we use things that actually we didn't need in the first place? And I'm holding a fork there. I'm thinking of the example of if we didn't use it in the first place, we'd be using our hands, which in many parts of the world we already do. I'm not advocating for not using forks. Any questions about this diagram before we go forward? Yeah, sometimes it's easier to ask questions as we're in the middle of this presentation.
Where's the energy input?
Energy input, yeah. So they've got energy. This is great. So every diagram can be picked apart, right? There are inputs into the system, these little tiny arrows that come into the top and things that come out, right? So again, this idea of closing waste loops, you're also trying to close energy loops. Yeah, no diagram is perfect, absolutely. And everything I'm going to show you today, there are things you can pick apart with it, absolutely. So another part of a circular economy is rethinking vocabulary. I already talked about the nutrients. Instead of just talking about goods, materials, thinking of things like aluminum as a nutrient. Another little bit of verbal gymnastics and rethinking is moving away from the term consumers. So a consumer has both an ecological and an economic use. In the ecological realm, we talk about as consumers are the ones that eat other consumers. And other producers, and some decomposers as well. In the economic sense, we're often talking about the consumers of our products, the consumers of this bottle, the consumers of our phone, the consumers of this product right here, or the consumers of food. If we start reframing that and think about it as users, we're using something. The consumer generally brings along this idea that we are done with it, right? We eat it and it's gone, which isn't really true. There's no thing that we typically consume unless it's a non-renewable resource, right? So things like fossil fuels, we consume it and then it's gone. It's nearly impossible to recapture the energy that was in that stored fossil fuel. But if we're using things and businesses start referring to their users as opposed to the consumers, you start going towards a shift. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next slide. So waste as well. In a circular system, waste is more of a verb. It's an action, not a noun. So again, drawing off of ecological principles, everything that comes out of another living creature is used. It has some other use. The outputs from humans, the consumers, have uses by decomposers. All of our solid waste should, at least I'm assuming in Champaign, is going to a water treatment facility where they're harnessing the energy from bacteria and decomposers to break that down because the bacteria love our outputs. So in an economic system, there's trillions of dollars available of economic opportunity for all the outputs from various industries, or just by redesigning some of the products that we have. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation uses this framework, and I'm stating some of what they're using right now, and then thinking about how this gets applied at a local level in some ways that I think it actually needs to be reframed. So they often use this term regenerative or restorative, which is wonderfully vague. And I like to think of that as like not just talking about the ecosystem, but also the economy and the people that are within it. So what does that mean to actually be regenerative or restorative? Oftentimes now when we talk about sustainability, we talk about doing less bad. Oh, we're gonna make our refrigerators more energy efficient or our cars more energy efficient. But ultimately, those products generally are still doing harm, either releasing carbon emissions or pollution. So it's reframing it to think about how can your business or your practice or your lifestyle not just be doing less harm, but actually doing good? Can you have a process that returns more nutrients back into the soil than you're taking, or aggregates it, or more money into a community than the equivalent resources that you're taking out of it? We have a system now, our economic system is very much based, I'll just give an example of the program Shark Tank, right? So Shark Tank, often they're focused on what's your product, what's your bottom line, what's your profit. There's very little discussion on who's getting money off of this, why is your product, why are you paying so little for the materials that you're getting into it, and who's going to benefit from the profits you get out of it, right? Every investor is always just focused on what am I going to get out of it, right? That's a typical consumer mentality. How much can I take? I'm a good businessman because I made the most money. I can get this development project done for less money than anybody else, and that makes me successful. When you really think about the total ecosystem, if you are constantly taking, I'll give a plant example, corn, right? Corn is a taker. It takes so many nutrients out of the soil and doesn't return it back. So we have to, you think about traditional agriculture where native peoples recognized this at a very base level and planted beans next to it. They went well. The beans actually replaced nitrogen into the soil. But the typical consumer mentality is, how much can I take? I'm more successful if I've been able to take. And whatever I give is, that's really nice, but that's not really part of your system. Like you're not necessarily successful by how much you've given, but by how much you were able to take for yourself or your business. So really, when I talk about circular systems, it's like, how does this give and take work? Shifting this paradigm from businesses that are just talking about profits to businesses that are setting up a system where there's something I can do in this world and either make the ecosystem or the environment or the community where I'm operating better while at the same time making money. That's how I talk about regenerative or restorative. And then within a circular economy, you have many different of those loops. I call the 1,000 re words: reuse, regenerate, reuse, refurbish, remanufacture, recycle. Anytime the ideal is spending less energy into what you're doing. And then this other bit of vernacular: materials, nutrients, molecules, whatever you want to call it. It's not waste. Waste is just an action. It's something I've determined has no value. And I'll go back to this. So this is great. This is awesome. It's made out of biologically based nutrients. However, if the end location is just going into a landfill, that's also wasteful. So if we're just sending these nutrients into a landfill where it'll be locked up and ultimately decompose and cause more greenhouse gases, we haven't really done anything. And that's where we talk about this whole system going together. This is a great step to start getting this material, but we also have to think about, on the other end, who's collecting it. And that's not something one individual can do. That takes a whole system changing. It takes businesses seeing an economic opportunity in this from collecting it and repurposing it either into another product like compost, or the government creating incentives to make that happen. And oftentimes it's both. And individuals who actually go out and buy this and use it. So in an idealized circular economy, renewable energy is a requirement. We can argue about when fossil fuels will run out. That's a valid argument to have. But what we can't argue is the fact that they will run out one day. They're going to be gone. And we cannot be relying on it forever, right? So maybe in my lifetime, they'll be there. I'll get to fly all around the world using fossil fuels, and maybe even my children as well. But there will be a day where we will not have them. We will run out. In an idealized circular economy, there's no such thing as a landfill. A landfill, again, is a wasteful thing to do. You're essentially saying, I have no use for these. These can be locked up where they're hard to access. Landfills, I'm assuming this audience is aware, but landfills are generally wasteful practices. We lock things away that we've decided have no value, or we're not willing to value. And then we end up creating extra carbon emissions, generally in the form of methane. We also want to minimize waste. I talked about that a lot. So waste, either waste energy or materials. the product economy moving towards a service economy. So this is a really critical one, and this runs counter to many things. Already today, can anybody think of an example of where we're using or owning less stuff and using it more as a service? Some cars? Yeah. Zip cars, right. Yeah, so zip cars would be an example. Uber and Lyft wouldn't, because it's still relying on personal ownership of those cars. So people are still buying more cars so they can drive, right? Another example would be streaming services. Spotify. Not too long ago, right, my car would get broken into for the CDs that were in it, and now these days people break into cars like, what is this? Get it out of here, right? I don't want that. Those get thrown all around because they have very little value. Nobody has CD players anymore. So that's an example of like you actually physically own less stuff. I actually still have 2 boxes of CDs in my closet, and I don't know what to do with it right now because I have this sort of emotional connection to it. Which brings up another example of a challenge of moving towards a service economy when you start thinking about things like clothes. So there are examples of companies that you pay a monthly fee, like for jeans, that you don't own. You're leasing the jeans. And then you can send it back or return it whenever you're done with it. Same with furniture. Think about furniture. Instead of owning the furniture, you're leasing it. That incentivizes a company to design products with materials that they can recapture in ways that they can be broken down and put back together again. You'll see more and more examples of this, primarily in Europe, but it's starting to happen in the US as well. Fast-moving goods, high-volume, frequent purchases should be biologically based. I talk about this. We tend to overuse a lot of packaging. If you've ever bought bananas or oranges at the store that have like styrofoam and plastic around them and you go, wait, didn't this fruit grow its own packaging? And then you're buying it again, or you're adding more to it. There are many instances where we don't need to use packaging where we do. And a lot of that times is not the fault necessarily. Some packaging issues don't have to do just with the company that's doing that. Sometimes there are regulations in place that demand that to happen for safety purposes. But this is where we get into things like this, where like we buy as consumers or users, we buy the products that we think are the best, but then the system isn't set up to recapture it. Where's the business that's going to take that and make it into an economic opportunity? And then the real challenge, growing an economy, which is what everyone loves to talk to from politicians and business leaders, growing the economy, but growing it in a way that we're not relying on new materials. So this idea of moving towards more services and less ownership of stuff or products is really key to that. But also businesses that are in the business of recapturing those materials. I liken it to like the decomposers in the economic system, the people that are taking the materials, taking them apart, making them accessible again to other businesses. And then a very critical thing, there's shared economic success. We have to share it. Each business, again, as businesses get bigger, you want a larger and larger slice of the pie, right? Businesses start thinking like, how do we corner the market on everything so we can maximize our profit? Smaller businesses in general, I found, tend to be a lot more collaborative. They're much more willing to be like, how can I partner with other businesses, even some that are making the same product as I am, so we collectively can benefit. Like 2 coffee companies working together on various things. This isn't across the board, but this idea of sharing success is kind of hard to grapple with when we talk about capitalism in general. I'll also bring another example, thinking about the theater world. Theater, right? Often theaters are thinking about competing against each other, but really when you think of someone who's just being introduced to theater, or someone who's just being introduced to a product like kombucha, you want your competitor actually to provide a good product, because if the consumer or the user experiences that and they have a bad experience, they're not going to buy your product, right? So it's counterintuitive, but many times I think we focus so much on being like, whoops, I want to be better and that other person's going to be worse, but really sometimes you want your competitors to be good, so someone who's new to that product will actually buy yours as well. And then equitable. So this is something that's very much lost with the current talk of circular economies. We don't talk about equity that much. And when you think about on the ground where we're located in the southwest side of Chicago, we're located in what is often referred to as a disinvested community. When you're there, you have to start thinking about what are you giving back to that community. There's not always easy answers, but you could design a circular system where all you're doing is sharing wealth and resources amongst a few powerful companies or a few powerful people. If you're not actually thinking about what you are giving back to that community where you're located, in my mind, you're also failing. So it's not just about, again, how much profit can you bring in, but how much can you share in this, either between yourself and other businesses, but the people that are around you that are providing the resources. Take many parts of Africa, where we constantly talk about all the resources we can take out of there, and what is actually being given back. Maybe we're not bringing those resources back in the same form, but something should be brought back. So a circular economy, the limitations right now. Yes?
Do you see any decrease in planned obsolescence?
Do I see a decrease in it, in planned obsolescence? Well, you see companies, I'm bringing up Apple, for example. So I don't know, it seems like a new product keeps coming out, right? And they're planning for that. But at the same time, making pledges to make all of their components recyclable and recapturable. Now, does that have to do with altruism? Probably it also has to do with the fact that there's a reality where things like rare earth metals are only coming from a few places on the earth, and most of that's in China. So the planned obsolescence thing, that's a hard one. I don't know. I don't know if I can quantify that. That's all, to me, it's all anecdotal right now. They're like pointing to places where that's happening. Some places where I think circular economy just isn't addressed. I talked about equity already. It also doesn't address open space, the places where we have a hard time valuing things economically. How do we value Yosemite? How do we value the park across the street from us? Open space, natural areas, wild areas, just they're historically very hard to value. And in many ways, it's trying to value your relationship with your spouse, right? How do you put an economic value on that? If anyone's been through a divorce, they probably have been forced to do that, but that was a little bit macabre right there. Also meeting your community needs and meeting ecosystem needs, right? So in a circular economy, if you're just talking about how do I keep this nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium flowing through it, are we also maintaining an ecosystem that is biologically diverse? Are we meeting the community needs in terms of jobs, right? These are things that just get often overlooked in circular economy, and frankly, often in sustainability communities as well. And there's this broader issue as well. When we talk about sustainability or environmentalism, it's often wrapped up these days, unfortunately, with issues of race and class. So when we start talking about environmentalism, inevitably many people will start thinking, well, that's what rich people can think about, right? And those people are the people that live on the north side of Chicago, and they're the ones that have more wealth and are generally white. There's a very real possibility that a circular economy movement could come that route could end up there as well, because it's often coming from these former sustainability managers and people that are already thinking around the sustainability lines. So this ever-shifting vocabulary and the terminology that we use, we've been evolving it over the decades. Like we talked about environmentalism, transcendentalism. We keep shifting kind of what words we use, where at the same time we have to shift it to make sure we are inclusive of all people. So I'll go to the plant, which many of you maybe were hoping to hear more about. We'll get to that a little bit. But the plant, I see it as a collaborative community of food businesses. Like I said, there's about 20 different food businesses all co-located together. There's actually not one entity called the plant. It is the building itself and the community of businesses and people inside it. There's Plant Chicago, the nonprofit, and then everyone else is actually a for-profit small food business. So we've taken these ideas of circular economy that have been really the thought leader of Ellen MacArthur and the foundation there, and started applying it. What does it look like when we start doing it at the facility scale? It's somewhere like the plant. We think about all energy should come from renewable sources, whether businesses buy it, build it, or install it. So we're working on an anaerobic digester project. We're going to have solar panels installed pretty soon in the next few weeks. And that's a part of our goal to make sure that we're moving towards 100% renewable energy. The materials that are used in product or packaging are able to be recaptured and or are safe to return to the environment or the biosphere. Materials, nutrients, and energy are sourced as locally as possible. Waste energy, and I put that in quotes, like nutrients and or materials, are recovered as close as possible to the processes. So that's where we talk about closing waste loops. Businesses share resources and information. So again, individual businesses not owning their own car, but maybe co-owning a car or sharing a car or working on a service together. And also sharing information. So we've started hosting these monthly gatherings where businesses can start sharing information on their packaging. Where are they sourcing it from? Businesses can start getting together and think about how do we collectively market together. Businesses working together to bring economic, environmental, and social benefit to the communities where they operate. Again, when we start talking about closing waste loops, we're not talking about closing ourselves emotionally and intellectually to the communities that we're operating in. You can be closed loop. If you're closing waste loops, you also have to be very open to what's going on around you and not being like, hey, this is mine, I'm keeping it, right? Business is sharing in economic success. Our success is predicated on the success of all the other businesses around us. The more businesses that start failing, really the less economic opportunity that we have, and that is actually kind of magnified around all the businesses around us. We lose when another business loses. And making sure that there's equitable success, that benefits are shared among all people, not just a few. So I'll give one example of a technology that is helping to push forward local circular economies, and that's anaerobic digestion. For you composters out there that are constantly turning your piles, imagine if you didn't have to do that, you could just shove it into a device, let it create lots of methane gas, and then collect it and use that as a fuel source. That's a project we're working on along with the for-profit owner of the building that we're in, is to actually become an aggregate for food waste on the southwest side of Chicago, diverting that food waste from going to a landfill and at the same time producing a product out of it. Nutrient-rich digestate in solid and liquid form, and then a gas that can be combusted for fuel right on site. Here's just one of many different examples of the ecosystem that we find at the plant. It's ever evolving. But it's not just this larger one where materials get fed into an anaerobic digester. There's connections between all of the businesses. So at the Plant Chicago, we run a demonstration aquaponics farm. It's a paradigm of a quote-unquote closed-loop system, only in the sense that you're constantly recycling water and nutrients. None of the nutrients leave the system except through the product, the greens itself. And I'm going a little fast here. I'm assuming you guys know about aquaponics and anaerobic digestion. Okay. I've made assumptions about my audience here today, which may or may not be correct. So that's a paradigm of it. Yet even then, I'm going to blow that apart. There's no real such thing as a closed-loop system. Even the Earth itself is not closed-loop. We're accepting a giant input of energy from the sun, without which we wouldn't exist. We're also losing molecules and energy to space every day, right? This is not a perfect system that we're dealing with. But the advantage of aquaponics from an environmental and ecological sense is that we're not releasing excess phosphorus and nitrogen and nutrients into the rivers and the oceans. Likewise, mushrooms. Mushrooms themselves, decomposers, the fungi, they take nutrients, break that down, make a fruiting body that consumers like us like to use, and then make those nutrients accessible again to other plants. Brewery has lots of spent grain that comes off of it. We've experimented with growing mushrooms off of it. It can be composted, fed to our livestock like fish and chickens. We've experimented with making biobriquettes to displace the use of imported wood in the wood-fired oven for the bakery. All of the outputs, the coffee roaster has coffee chaff, which is nitrogen-rich. It can be used as an energy source for mushrooms. We could use it as bedding for our chickens. There's lots of different uses for it. Simplest one, as many of you know, is composting. Finally, I'm just going to do one schematic here. This is a shot we constantly invite many university graduate and PhD students in to use the system to experiment with it, test it, maybe ask questions that we don't like the answers to. Use it as a system to test some assumptions that we've been dealing with over the last few years. And this was a material flow analysis that a student from France and UIC did last year, essentially over a 3-month period, did a snapshot of all the materials flowing into the system, all the materials flowing out, and then this one of what was flowing in between the different businesses. And finding that the overwhelming majority of the material into the system was water and spent grain, and all of that spent grain was being recaptured on site. So we were capturing a lot of materials on site and not letting that go out to a landfill. And that's, I think I've wrapped up. I'm supposed to start entertaining more questions now. I'm used to talking for about an hour and a half on this, or an hour and a half on this topic. So ask away, please. Yes.
So to make circular economy go, it might require at least a thought toward policy considerations, particularly at the neighborhood level on behalf of city and local municipalities. I suspect that Plant Chicago is in many conversations with local municipalities. Could you talk to us about some kind of conversations that you have, what the opportunities are, doing distributed or microgrids near to your building, for example, isn't necessarily, it sort of goes beyond normal thinking of centralized power resource, which is well out of the city. So what other examples of?
So yeah, community solar or community, oh, sorry, yeah, I'll reframe the question. Yeah. So the question was thinking about policy. Really, what sort of policies and conversations need to happen in order to start incentivizing the circular economy. So there's different parts of that. Certainly energy is a critical component of that. The fact that the state is actually setting renewable energy goals is really important. The cities themselves should be setting renewable energy goals. That's something that's perfectly within the agency of cities to do. And not just within their own municipal buildings, but requiring it for other installations as well. There is this ongoing tension between energy companies, right? Our economic model for energy is like for-profit, highly regulated for-profits that are not incentivized to let individuals become small power plants. And the more of these community solar projects that take away profits from that entity, the more literally their power in many ways is challenged. So it is figuring out ways for energy companies to benefit from that, either through power purchase agreements, owning the solar panels. There's also just challenges with the way their grid is set up too as well. It was set up for, for large power plants as well, and then transfer stations as well. So in many ways, there's a lot of economic opportunity in underdeveloped countries where you have this brand new slate to start with empowering communities to be producing their own power, either through community solar as well. In the state of Illinois, too, the opportunity as well is with food waste. So in many parts of the world, again, and even in the US, places that have enacted landfill or food waste bans, so not saying food waste cannot go to a landfill, that immediately creates this sort of opportunity to start diverting the food waste. Well, we tend to undervalue things like compost as well, so it's creating the right market for that. The biggest hurdle for things like anaerobic digestion right now are the markets for the products. Energy is generally very low in the Midwest, and landfill tipping fees are generally very low. And waste haulers, if they own a landfill, absolutely have no incentive not to send food waste to the landfill unless they build a facility where they're just taking food waste and turning that into a product. So part of this would be a food waste ban. Another thing would be making sure that government is stepping in and the costs of like compost or actually collecting this material and sending it to an industrial recycling composting facility is not borne just by small households or by small companies, right? So that's always the question, is like, who pays for that? And who's making money off of it? Yes?
The speaker earlier from Little Village was talking about their projects.
Oh, who was that? Wasserman Schultz? Yeah.
She was here just a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, cool.
She pointed out that it's illegal to compost
In Chicago?
food waste, residential. I think you could do
No, that's recently changed, so it's legal now.
working on it, but
Oh, okay. No, there's an ordinance now in Chicago that stipulates that. Yeah, you can compost. Now, there's restrictions around it as well, and some of them are a little bit odd, like stipulating how much you can compost by area, right, as opposed to volume as well. There's a compost ordinance in Chicago now. Yeah, it's legal to do it. We don't have so chickens. If you have chickens, you call those your pets, right? You don't call that. Yeah. So there's still.
maybe she was getting at, you could do residential composting at home, but if you wanted to do a business, maybe?
No, you can do it. You can do it. There's restrictions around it now, but no, historically people were doing. I mean, practically speaking, people were doing it already, and just doing it because they're like, I'm going to do it. But no, it is legal to do it now, and there's at least 6 different food waste haulers in the city of Chicago. Yeah, that are composting. Yes.
So is your website informative and consumer friendly?
User friendly, yes. It is. Yeah, our Plant Chicago's website is pretty simple. I think most of it's quite static, but if you actually go to our website and check out the news and events, that's where we keep blogs, and we post reports and white papers on some of the research projects we're working on as well. Yeah, so that's the more dynamic part of the site. Yeah. Yes.
Would it be fair to say that your goal is to be a demonstrator or an incubator?
Yeah.
And if so, which of the technologies or combinations of technologies have you seen that you think are ready to scale?
Okay, so yes, the question was about, is our goal to be demonstration and an incubator? Those are kind of, there's 2 separate but complementary things. So Plant Chicago, we do demonstrate and interpret around a lot of things. We also will talk about the places where we think we're failing, or just this is like, we tried this and this is ridiculous. Or we found it's just not practical, right, at this point. Or we thought this was a good idea, but really it's not going to save like carbon in the atmosphere. The incubation thing is something we've been talking about a lot. We're incubating there's lots of talk around business incubation, but typically it's about how do we incubate it? How do we incubate a single business? We're looking about how do we incubate a system, right? How do we incubate a resilient system of businesses that are working together? Yeah, and that to me is the really exciting thing about where we're operating. The second part of your question.
Any technologies or
Oh.
combinations you think are ready to scale?
So I'm also a bit of a Luddite in terms of technology. I think we have an over-dependence on relying on technology to be our savior. So we create a new technology that comes with a whole host of new problems, or a new platform that is like great at first, and then we realize the problems like 2 years later, like after an election. We will. Anaerobic digestion, to me, is the thing that cities need to figure out how to invest in, right? These are not, in general, they're not projects, or even aerobic digestion, large compost facilities. I mean, either one, they're cheaper to install, the aerobic ones. But really supporting this idea of the compost and recollection of food waste is necessary, and the economics don't always, they're hard to work out because it's a low profit margin for that product that comes out of it. So to me, the role of government is providing the incentives or the mandates that will help stimulate that economy, the economy of recapturing food waste as well. So aerobic, just composting itself is one simple technology. Again, I think about technology as like, how do we simplify it? We don't we don't need to make it too complicated. Yes, back there, yeah.
So I'm currently working for a startup, and
Yeah,
basically it starts a dress rental system on college campuses.
it starts what?
A dress rental system
Oh, cool.
for college campuses. So I was wondering if you think that would fit in a circular economy because it's like the dresses are from girls' closets that they already own. Or
Yeah,
like-
so you're providing a service,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the question is, this enterprise, this entrepreneur is starting a company based on renting dresses to prevent, to take, really take advantage of the existing resources that are out there, that many women have these beautiful dresses in their closets that they've worn once, and many men have suits in our closets that we've maybe worn once, right? I actually have a whole host of suits in my closet that were my father's, and I don't want to get rid of them because they're emotionally, they mean something to me, right? Maybe I could start making money off of them, right? And renting them out. Absolutely, that to me would sound like a circular business model. You're removing materials from this, the economic system, but at the same time providing a valuable service to people. Yeah, that's a really exciting business model. I'd like to see how that works. Yeah. And tell me more about it when it launches. Wait, I just want to make sure someone else doesn't have a question first. Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
This sounds really unique. Do you know of other places throughout the United States? Are there anything like this?
So I get that question a lot. Is there anything like the plant? There are certainly places that I've heard that are similar to it, or have similar aspirations. There's a place in Portland called The Red, which to me sounds like it has this community of businesses in it. There's certainly many projects that will talk about incubating businesses, or bringing in like the next round of entrepreneur, like, you know, businesses that are going to change the world. But ultimately, when I look at those projects over many years, what you've got is a series of tenants, like individual businesses that might individually be doing something cool, but we don't actually know kind of what the collective impact is or the collective goal sharing is there. I'm not saying the plant is at all an idealized system, but that's what we're working towards. I also point out too, it was started, this is another example of like one individual buying the building and saying, I'm going to kind of start building this. So over the course of years, John Adel bought the building in 2010 and just started repurposing it. But it's evolved very organically from there. Where it is today is not quite where it was when it started, right? So it's evolved over time. I've heard of I'm talking to folks in London, other breweries that like kind of they're like, what do I do with my waste? And we think about, well, maybe there's other businesses you can attract that will use that spent grain right on site. It's not quite a circular economy example, but there's a place called Kalundborg, which is an industrial symbiosis example. We're a coal power plant. Actually, lots of businesses kind of emerged around it, taking the outputs from there, like turning the fly ash into other products, or either some of the products being turned into like concrete and things like that. So that's an example of a symbiotic relationship that kind of has this flavor to it, but it doesn't quite fit in the circular economy example because it's relying on this non-renewable source of energy as its anchor, right? Ultimately, the coal that's used in the input is going to run out one day. Yes?
Continue that, there is a local incubator for nonprofits that's just starting up. It's like funded by the Community Foundation of East Central Illinois at cfeci.org, and it's designed to take nonprofits and give them startup experience and help them interact with each other. There's a group of local partners that are contributing expertise. So this is just getting going now.
You can find, the point was that there's another nonprofit incubator. There's lots of incubators out there for sure. I think all the aspects together in this system, I don't know that exists. Certainly not the anaerobic digester in an urban environment is unusual. There's 2,000 of them already in the US. Most of those are in municipalities and wastewater treatment facilities where they're taking in human waste and turning that into a biosolid. And then the rest most of those are near dairy farms. So dealing with a literal pile of mess that they need to deal with, right? But oftentimes that's dealing with a large quantity of material that a single entity has. This is unusual in the fact that it's saying, like, we're going to take the stuff that the city collectively is creating and make economic opportunity out of it. There's lots of businesses around that will take inputs from that. Yeah. Yes.
My son is an activist in our city in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
That anything you have to burn is not acceptable. Is there a chemical in anaerobic
Digestion?
digestion? Yeah, is that
You input, so this is you're inputting organic waste, so food waste.
but there's no chemical used in that? He said there's a chemical process where you can break down waste.
Sure. I mean, a lot of Europe is powered on waste to energy, which is essentially burning trash. The anaerobic digestion in itself, though, you're not, unless your input is mostly like pesticides, you're not dealing with that. Because, think about tons of spent brewer's grain, right? That's not filled with chemicals. Does that make sense?
Well, I think he was talking about using a chemical
Oh.
to destroy waste.
Oh, that could be. I mean, there's lots of entrepreneurs out there that are looking. Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. The question was whether there's a chemical that could break down certain types of waste. Yes, and then we'll get to your question. Yes.
What's the difference between what you do and those who are believing that ultimately we will have to go to 100% recycling of everything that we make in order to be able to deal with all the needs of the world's population?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, yeah, we have to do that one day. Once you've extracted everything from the earth, you have to figure out how to keep it flowing again, right? So the question was like whether we have to, some people say whether we have to move towards 100% recycling or, yeah, that's this idea behind the circular economy is that there's a certain thing already, right? Think about, so fossil fuels is one example. Phosphate rock is another one. We rely on phosphate rock to make synthetic fertilizers as a phosphorus input. And essentially what we're doing is taking it out of rocks in Morocco and then making it into the fertilizer, shoving that into the ground. Most of that runs off into the rivers and then the Gulf of Mexico. We're losing all that phosphorus. So we have to find a system where we recapture the phosphorus or use less of it. Because like phosphate rock isn't made in a couple of years, right? So in the same, a similar thing with nitrogen, right? We rely on the nitrogen for synthetic fertilizers. Most of that's coming from the air. And it relies on a huge energy input from fossil fuels, right? So there's a day where when fossil fuels run out, we won't be able to extract nitrogen from the air that easily, unless we have a new energy source like nuclear fusion or hydrogen, right? Yeah. Yes, your question.
I was going to say, they mentioned another example from the US. If you go to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website, on which plants listed as one of their illustrations, you'll find a handful, and there aren't many. But one thing the website does have are many illustrations where you find circular economy in different applications. And I think one opportunity for the University of Illinois, and I don't know who's associated with the university and who's community members, is the fact that the University of Illinois is a system. And also Champaign-Urbana has a very healthy medical system too. So these are large institutions with a lot of clout, a lot of power, and a lot of vested interest to, for example, use your voices, to start to make these institutions secular. Because the university and the, say for example, the health system, they buy a lot of the product. So where do those products come from? If they come outside of the University of Illinois, outside of the UMI in a sort of regional context, is there an opportunity to bring them or create those products locally? Smaller companies that are more local, more regional to that system, so that will create business opportunities for other communities that need jobs, need good jobs.
Yeah.
So maybe you point to
Yeah, so the point that she was making is that universities like University of Illinois can be the drivers of economic systems for sure, as through their investments. We often talk about disinvesting from fossil fuels, but there's also an opportunity in terms of the purchasing, right? Making goals and mandates around purchasing policies for the biological nutrients, or setting up systems for recapturing it. Supporting entrepreneurs that are working on circular systems. Certainly an opportunity for universities to do that. That definitely takes buy-in from the highest levels, and oftentimes that buy-in is led by the people at the bottom, right? That demand these things to happen. So there's that, but also she was mentioning the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is a resource. So you were asking about other examples. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation website is a great place to go. It is a resource for us as well. We are one of their Circular Economy 100 emerging innovators in the U.S. So we're a part of that network with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but there's also lots of great case studies of other examples of circular economy happening or the potential of it happening. Now, one challenge often that happens is that we talk about a single company that is circular, which to me is, it's impossible to be circular by yourself. You can close your own waste loops, but ultimately there's inputs in and inputs out that require working with other businesses. You're buying, how many companies actually can source their own material and then sell it and get it back without any other company intervening, right? You have to work with other companies. So collaborative, we say the circular economy is a collaborative practice. Any other questions or comments? Any skepticism? That's good if you are. Skeptics are like, don't want to talk. All right. Yeah, okay, good. Well, thanks. I'll stick around for questions. Thank you.